friends, welcome back to my channel, or welcome if you're new. So unfortunately my mics have broke. I did drop my phone when this was connected, and the connecting transmitter is now fried. It does not connect to the mics, so if it does sound slightly different, I do apologize. I will need to get some for filming in 2025, but for the rest of the year my videos are going to be without mics. So in November I did read these 7 books. Lots of varied reading. I forgot to prepare my stats for November. Around 3,000, 4,000 pages read, and I've got no 5 stars. I've got no 5 stars this month. I've got 4s, 3s and 2s, so that's interesting. And I'm going to start with the most recently finished and work my way back through the month to give you my thoughts on the books and yeah, wrap up my November reading. So the first one is Now Conjures by Freddie Kolch. I don't really know if I'm pronouncing that name right, but this was an ARC that was kindly gifted to me from Electric Monkey. This is a story that is about a group of teenagers who live in the 90s. They form their coven. One of their members, their friends in this coven, dies, and they get sucked into this whole ancient evil and discovering the true story about this person who ends up dying, and nobody remembers them. So they kind of like try and fight the evil power, get their friend back, understand what's going on in this town and by this evil entity. North Coven is what they're called. This is definitely written for a YA audience. It does read rather younger than I read, but it was an interesting read. I really enjoyed delving into these characters, so learning about their relationships, their friendships and their struggles, and also the magic that's in here. It's definitely interesting, and it is a good read. I did give it a 3-star because it was pretty average in terms of content that I usually enjoy. This really wasn't a standout, so to speak, but it was still really interesting to delve into and to learn more about. And I am really thankful to the publishers for sending this to me. It was published in June of this year, so I am kind of late to getting to it, but it would make the perfect book to read in October because that is the time period that it is set around. It is in the 1990s. It is set around October and November, so yeah, definitely an interesting read. But if you don't tend to read like YA stories, then I probably would avoid it if that's not your cup of tea. Next up is a winter story that is my first winter story this kind of half of the year, and that is Cold Snap by Lindy Ryan. This is a really short novella that is centered around Christmas, so I did read this at the very end of November alongside Now Conjures, but I did finish this one before Now Conjures. So yeah, this one is set on Christmas Eve and Christmas Day. It is following a small family who have this massive tragedy that happens to them in the lead up to Christmas. The father in this story ends up dying, falling off the roof by putting up Christmas lights, and they booked a cabin for the Christmas period, and they still end up going to this cabin, the mother and the son, with their cat. It is very heavy in grief. It does explore what it's like to lose a loved one, what it makes you feel, what you end up like thinking you see, and it really does test your mental capabilities when you're trying to deal with a tragedy but still provide for the family. So it does center a lot around that grief and making it more horror-y and wintry. So they get isolated at the cabin, and then shit hits the fan. Lots of things happen. I will say there is explicit cat death in this story, and it does get talked about a lot following the actual event. So if you're not into animal death or a lot of descriptions or discussions about it, then I would probably stay away from this one. But it is an interesting read. It explores grief in another way, and I always feel like winter horror books and grief really do go well together. So it was an interesting book to read. It just took me, for being a novella, it did take me ages to get through because I did get a bit ill with migraines, and I just did not want to read. And this doesn't have an audiobook, at least not in the UK. So I did have to read this one physically, and at the time I couldn't pick it up. So I was reading 2 chapters, leaving it for a week, picking it up again, and then yeah, for me, I just could not really connect with it all that well. But I did think that it was an interesting read, and it is probably a good one to pick up in the wintertime for us horror lovers. But stay clear if you're not a fan of animal death. We have a fantasy book, and that is After the Forest by Kel Woods. This is a story that is a retelling of Hansel and Gretel, but it's following Hansel and Gretel 20 years in the future. So what happens after the events of those children cooking the witch in her oven. It is such an incredible read. This is so atmospheric, and to me this time of year is perfect for fairy tales and fairy tales retellings, and this one was so good. I'm so glad that I actually managed to read it. Also, this edition is just stunning. So we're following Greta, who is living her life after the events that happened to her and her brother. She has the witch's cookbook, so she makes her incredible gingerbread. There's a lot of dark magic popping up again in the forest, and the acts of her childhood and those misadventures pop back up, and she ends up going on this adventure to kind of solve what is exactly is happening with the dark magic. She also then discovers a lot about her childhood and why things happened the way they did and what it means for her now. It's a really good self-discovery story and understanding past events, and also like getting used to a new way of life after a traumatic event whilst everybody else is still questioning it. So this one is definitely a very good, interesting read, especially around November, December. It's a 4-star book for me. It's not a 5 simply because of the writing style. It did take me a little bit to get into it, but once I was in the story, I did really enjoy it, and I thought the overall outcome was great as well. Next up, I read My Darling Dreadful Thing by Johanna van Veen. This is a book I think is in the Goodreads Choice Awards, and it has been on my shelves since June. Needed to pick it up because it does scream gothic, and I do always say this time of the year is a really good time for gothic stories because they are eerie and very Christmassy to me. So yes, My Darling Dreadful Thing is following a girl who is used by her mother and is not treated the best. She is forced to be a medium because she has this ability to speak to a spirit who is like her guide, Ruth, and you kind of follow her development through life. She gets taken in by a widow. She gets taken in by a young widow, Agnes, to get away from her mother, and a lot of stuff happens following that. I did think this was a really slow build. Obviously, it's gothic, it is. And the subject matter that it discusses is very intense, but so necessary, and it is an interesting book to read. So yeah, this one was a good book, and I did enjoy my time reading it. I don't know if I would reread it though. It doesn't have that reread factor for me. So yeah, My Darling Dreadful Thing was interesting and kind of like a supernatural murder mystery. So take with that what you will, and let me know in the comments if you've read this book, what you thought of it, or any of these. I would love to hear your thoughts. Read was The Corey Girls by Jess Laurie. This was for the Thrills and Chills book club. So the Thrills and Chills book club, they kindly invited me to be a guest host for November for this book, and we read this, had the live discussion in the middle of November. So I'll leave a link to that discussion so you can go and check that out to hear all of our thoughts on this book and what we really think about the characters and all of that good stuff. So I'll leave that linked down below. Four Girls is set in a small town that all of these houses are connected through basement tunnels. They play in the tunnels and anybody can get into the tunnels through those houses. So when you're in the basement, they would play around and stuff, but these group of friends discover something that they really probably shouldn't have discovered, and then all of these young girls start to go missing in this town. Some of them end up coming up dead in the quarry, and there's this big mystery around who is it, what is going on in this town, and it is really centered around the few of females in the 1970s and what they used to go through. I say used to go through, I mean we are kind of seeing that in today again, but this is a very interesting story to delve into and kind of learn the backgrounds, and the fact that it is about a serial killer, but it is more about the victims and the victims' families and their loved ones and what they're going through rather than focused on the serial killer. So I really enjoyed that aspect of the Corey Girls, and it really gave it a lot of dimension. This was an incredible read. I really enjoyed it. It is such a thrilling, hooked story. You never want to put it down. Like, I kept reading this because I did love it so much. So really did enjoy reading the Corey Girls, and I rated it a 4-star. So the second book that I finished in November was Woman Eating by Claire Coda. I wasn't too sure going into this story what to expect. So this is essentially following a girl who is a vampire, wanting but not wanting to drink people's blood. So it's a book that explores your identity, addictions, and kind of self-control. It was an interesting book to read I didn't actually enjoy it as much as I was hoping to. Again, I think it's because of the writing. I just could not connect with it all that well. It took me a little bit to really get into the story, but the way the characters were developed, especially our main character, and how she really copes with her identity and the addiction that she has, then I did really start to enjoy it after getting into it a little bit more. And finally, the last book, but the first book I read in the month of November, was Hex by Jenny Fagan. I wasn't sure that I would enjoy this because I absolutely hated Luckin Booth by this author, which I read earlier in the year. But Hex, oh my god, I adored this book. Actually, I do think this was the 5-star. This was the only 5-star from November. So I forgot that I had rated this 5. So Hex is essentially following these North Berwick witch trials. So North Berwick is literally like outside Edinburgh. It's not too far away from where I currently live. So yeah, it's an interesting take on those witch trials. We follow someone who can astral project into the past, and they have this conversation with the witch who is about to be burned. So this is a beautiful story that connects women, and no matter what time period that you're from, it showcases that society is always scared of powerful women, and this explores that. So it talks about how in the past, so where our main character Iris is projected back to, and she did this in 1591 on the 4th of December, which is the day I'm filming this. So she goes back to 1591 to talk to Gellis. We're just gonna go with that, and talks to her about where she's from and ways to help her in the lead up to this awful event. And it is so heartwarming and heart-wrenching. I was so touched by reading this story. I really loved this book, and yeah, I mean, the way it is written is just so incredible, and how it showcases these women to be just women with real emotions. She's not a witch, but she's still being prosecuted and killed because they fear her, and it really delves deeper into her thoughts and her fears. And yeah, so this story does develop so well. It covers a lot of themes around society's superstitions and their fears, and how someone's crusade can really start up a mob mentality, and yeah, and how people who band together can really help support. So this story was incredible. I loved reading this book, and this is my library copy, but I do really want to buy a copy of my own because I will reread this 100%. This is a stunning story, and I feel like anybody needs to read this because it is just beautiful. Yeah, I did have a 5-star this month, and it is Hex. And so there you have it. Those are my November books that I read. Like I said, varied reading, covered a lot of stories by women, for women, and about women, or LGBTQ. And yeah, I thought it was an incredible month for me. Whilst they weren't all hits, I did enjoy my time reading all of the books. And now that December is already here, I am already enjoying all of the books that I'm reading this month. So in the next video you will probably see my Christmas reading video, and yeah, I guess until next time, keep your pages turning and embrace the darkness. Bye!